Taejun Kwan had learned, at the age of 19, that kindness was a currency like any other, and that most people who offered it were only waiting to be paid. He had learned this on the night his father's oldest friend, a man who had held him as a baby and taught him to tie his first necktie, put a bullet through his father's chest and smiled while doing it. The betrayal had not come from a stranger. It had come from someone who had spent decades being warm, being generous, being trusted, and every soft word that man had ever spoken turned out, in the end, to be an investment maturing toward a single, devastating withdrawal. By the time Taejun took control of what remained of the Kwan organization, he had built himself into something closer to a fortress than a man. He tested everyone. He gave his lieutenants opportunities to steal from him, then watched to see who did. He fed his own men false information, then traced the leaks to find out who could not be trusted with truth. He did not raise his voice, he did not need to. His silence itself had become a verdict that men feared. In the underworld of the city, they called him many things: the Winter King, the Ledger, the man who never blinked. But never once did they call him kind, because kindness, in his experience, was the mask worn just before the knife came out. He kept a small black notebook, never digital, never traceable, in which he recorded the names of men who had failed his tests and the exact nature of their failure, so that he would never again be surprised by a face he had once trusted. His captains joked, when they thought he could not hear them, that Taejun Kwan trusted his ledger more than he trusted his own reflection, and they were not entirely wrong. A ledger, at least, did not smile at you the night before it killed your father. He had inherited an organization fractured by grief and hungry for weakness, and he had spent a decade welding it back into something that did not bend, at considerable cost to whatever softness might once have lived in him. He did not drink to excess, did not gamble, did not surround himself with the noise other men in his position used to drown out silence, because silence, to Taejun, was simply honest, and he had come to prefer the honesty of an empty room to the performance of a crowded one. Loyalty, in his organization, was purchased with fear and maintained with vigilance. And he had grown so used to expecting betrayal around every corner that peace, when it came at all, felt less like relief and more like the held breath before another blow. He ran his empire from glass towers and private rooms, but once every few weeks, dressed in plain gray clothes with no watch, no rings, no driver waiting outside, he disappeared into the ordinary city the way a shark might slip beneath calm water, not to rest, but to watch. It was on one of these nights, while quietly observing a shipment changing hands 2 streets from the harbor, that the rain came down hard and sent him ducking into the nearest lit doorway, which happened to be a small, tired diner with a flickering sign that read "The Harbor Light." He sat in the corner booth farthest from the window, the way he sat everywhere, with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. The diner smelled of frying oil and old coffee, and the linoleum floor was cracked in a shape that looked, if a person were feeling fanciful, like the coastline of some country nobody had ever visited. He had not intended to stay long. Then a woman approached his table with a notepad and a tired, unguarded smile, and something in Taejun's carefully calibrated mind quietly, imperceptibly, shifted. Her name, stitched crookedly onto a name tag that had clearly been sewn by hand rather than issued by any corporate uniform department, was Amara. She had the kind of face that did not perform for anyone. No practiced warmth, no salesperson's brightness, just a plain and genuine attentiveness, as though whoever sat across from her was, for that moment, the only thing that mattered. She asked what he wanted. He said he did not know yet. She said that was fine and left him the menu and did not hover, and did not ask twice. And somehow that small mercy of being left alone without being ignored unsettled him more than anything a rival boss had said to him in years. He ordered black coffee and nothing else, because he had, quite deliberately, left his wallet at his penthouse that evening as one of the small rituals he used to test the ordinary world the way he tested his own men. When the bill came, he patted his jacket with practiced, unhurried confusion and told her in a flat voice that gave nothing away, that he seemed to have left his money behind. He watched her face the way he watched every face, for the flicker of calculation. For the moment someone decided how much this stranger might be worth exploiting, whether through pity extracted for a tip later, or through humiliation dispensed for the crime of not being able to pay. Amara did not flicker. She said it happened to everyone, that the coffee was on the house and that he looked like a man who needed a meal more than he needed a lecture about it, and before he could protest, she had brought him a plate of rice and grilled fish that was not on the bill and never would be. He asked her, testing again, why she would do that for someone she had never met and would likely never see again. She shrugged and said that she had gone hungry more nights than she liked to remember, and that somebody once had done the same for her without asking for anything back, and that she had promised herself she would pass it forward whenever she could. She said it so simply, without performance, that Taejun, who had built an empire on the premise that nothing was ever given without an invoice attached, found himself with no tests left to run. He left without paying and told himself he would never come back. He came back 4 nights later. He came back under the name June, a name with no weight, no history, no fear attached to it. He told himself each time that this was reconnaissance, that a boss needed to understand every corner of his territory, including the unglamorous ones, that Amara and her diner were simply useful cover for the parts of the city he could not otherwise observe unnoticed. He told himself many things. None of them explained why he found himself, over the following weeks, arranging his schedule around her shifts, or why he began paying close, careful attention to the particular rhythm of her voice when she was tired versus when she was merely quiet. He tested her the way he tested everyone, because it was the only language he knew for trust. He left a wallet stuffed with far more cash than any meal required, sitting carelessly on the table, then stepped outside and watched through the window to see what she would do. She ran out into the street after him, breathless, holding it out with both hands, scolding him for being careless with his money as though he were a foolish younger brother rather than a stranger. He told her once a fabricated story about needing money for a sick relative, framing it so that a person motivated by profit would see an easy opening to offer a loan and collect on it later with interest with leverage. Amara simply reached into her own apron, where her tip money for the week sat folded in a rubber band, and pressed it into his hand without a single question about how or when he would pay her back. He tried once, cruelly, to see if she gossiped, dropping a piece of invented and unflattering information about himself to a regular customer who he knew talked freely, then waiting to see if it traveled back to her distorted and embellished. It never did. He tried a colder test still. On a night when he arrived visibly bruised from a confrontation earlier that evening, watching her closely to see whether concern for a stranger's injuries was, underneath, a search for an opening, an unspoken invoice for sympathy that would come due later in the form of a favor asked or a secret pried loose. She only brought him ice wrapped in a clean cloth, told him to hold it against his cheekbone before it swelled worse, and went back to refilling salt shakers as though tending to a bruised stranger's face were the least remarkable thing in her evening. He sat there holding the cold cloth to his jaw and found with a kind of quiet horror that he had run out of tests to run, that every scenario he could invent to expose the invoice hidden beneath her kindness kept returning the same stubborn, uncomplicated answer. There was no invoice. There never had been. Amara, for her part, was not entirely blind to the strangeness of him, the way his eyes tracked the door of the diner the way a soldier's might, the way certain men who came in sometimes straightened when they saw him and left again without ordering, the careful blankness he wore like a second uniform. But she had learned, in a hard childhood, that everyone was carrying something they did not explain, and she had decided long ago that she would rather extend an ordinary decency and occasionally be wrong about someone than harden herself against a whole world of strangers to avoid being wrong even once. It was not naivety. It was a discipline, chosen and maintained on purpose, the same way Tae-jun had chosen and maintained his suspicion, and it was that discipline, more than any single act of generosity, that eventually began to dismantle him. Every test he built to prove that her kindness was, underneath, the same transactional performance every other kindness in his life had turned out to be, came back with the same maddening, humbling result. She simply was who she appeared to be. It should have made him suspicious in an entirely different way. No one was that consistent, that unguarded, without either extraordinary discipline or extraordinary sincerity, and Tae-jun did not believe in the former without motive. But the longer he watched her, the more the old architecture in his chest, the one built brick by brick out of his father's murder and every betrayal since, began to feel less like armor and more like a room he had locked himself inside of. He started arriving not to test her anymore, but simply because the diner, with its cracked linoleum and its burnt coffee and its one waitress who asked nothing of him, had become the only place in the city where he was not the Winter King. He was only Jun. And Jun, unlike Tae-jun, was allowed to be tired. He learned her story slowly, in fragments offered during slow hours when the diner emptied out and she leaned against the counter instead of standing behind it. She had lost her parents young, in a fire that had also taken the modest restaurant they owned, and she had raised her younger brother, Minho, largely on her own from the age of 17, working double shifts and skipping meals so that he could stay in school. She spoke about it without self-pity, the way a person speaks about weather they have simply learned to dress for. She had no family in any of the organizations that ran the docks or the districts nearby. His men, whom he set, almost against his own better judgment, out of an old habit he could not quite retire, to quietly verify every word of her background, confirmed it all within a week. No ties, no debts, no hidden agenda, no leverage anyone could hold against her, nothing to be gained by befriending a stranger except, apparently, the plain fact of befriending him. His head of security, A careful man named Sunwoo, who had served Taejun's father before him, delivered the file personally and said, with unusual bluntness for a man who rarely offered opinions, that in 20 years he had never seen a file come back this clean, and that clean, in their world, usually meant one thing, except this time, it seemed to mean exactly what it said. She was simply good. He asked Sunwoo once, half ashamed of the question even as he voiced it, whether it was possible for a file to come back clean because a person was simply that good, without any hidden ledger of their own waiting to be discovered. Sunwoo, who had buried Taejun's father and had spent 20 years watching the son build himself into something harder than the man he mourned, said that he had asked himself the same question walking out of the archive room, and that in 2 decades of vetting judges, rivals, informants, and lovers on behalf of 2 generations of Kwan men, he had genuinely never encountered a person with nothing to hide before. He said it carefully, the way a man delivers news he suspects his employer does not entirely want, and then he added, almost gently, that perhaps it was not Taejun's job to keep searching for the flaw in her, but to examine why he found her honesty so difficult to simply accept as real. Taejun did not answer him. He took the file home that night and read it 3 more times, not looking for anything new, but because some part of him wanted, for once, to sit inside a piece of evidence that did not eventually curdle into betrayal. That knowledge did something to Taejun that no negotiation, no assassination attempt, no boardroom betrayal had ever managed. It cracked him open. He began telling her small true things in exchange for her small true things, not his name, not his business, but real fragments nonetheless. That he had lost his father violently and young, that he trusted almost no one, that he had built his life around the assumption that everyone eventually showed you the knife they had been hiding. Amara listened to these confessions the way she listened to everything, without flinching and without trying to fix him. And one evening, closing up the diner alone with him after the last customer had gone, she told him that the fact he was still capable of noticing kindness, after everything, meant that whoever had hurt him had not actually managed to take the whole of him. He did not know what to say to that. He sat in the booth long after she had finished wiping down the counter, and for the first time in more than a decade, Taejun Kwan put his head in his hands, not from exhaustion, but from something dangerously close to grief finally finding an exit. Their evenings together grew longer and quieter and less accidental. He walked her home along the harbor when her shifts ended late, matching his stride to her tired one, saying little, simply present in a way he had never allowed himself to be present with anyone whose loyalty he had not first purchased or coerced. She began teasing him, gently, the way people tease someone they have decided is safe, about his stern face and his refusal to ever order dessert, and he found, to his own considerable astonishment, that he liked being teased, liked being ordinary, liked the particular warmth of being looked at by someone who wanted nothing from the empire he had spent his whole adult life defending. One night, on the pier with the lights of the harbor scattered across the black water like something spilled and never cleaned up, he almost told her everything. He almost said his real name. He almost let the Winter King step forward and introduce himself to the one person who had never once asked to meet him. He did not yet, because some old and frightened part of him still believed that the moment she knew what he truly was, the kindness would end, the way every warm thing in his life eventually had. There were ordinary evenings, too, that had nothing to do with tests or ledgers or the empire at all. An afternoon when he showed up at the diner with a small, badly wrapped gift for her brother's birthday because she had mentioned, in passing, that Minho loved a particular comic series and could never afford the newest volume. A night when the two of them sat on an overturned crate behind the diner sharing a single plate of noodles because the kitchen had run out of everything else, and Taejun, who had eaten at tables set with imported crystal and never once tasted anything he remembered afterward, found that he remembered every bite of that meal for weeks. He began to notice, with something like alarm, that he thought about her constantly even in rooms full of men discussing shipping routes and territory disputes, that he had started measuring the value of his own long, careful life against the small unguarded hour he might get to spend at her counter that evening. It frightened him more than any rival ever had, because a rival could be identified, contained, negotiated with, or eliminated, and this, whatever this softening was, obeyed none of the rules he had spent a decade mastering. That hesitation did not go unnoticed by the men who served him. Daeho, his father's nephew and Taejun's own second-in-command, had watched his cousin's schedule bend itself around a harbor diner for weeks with a mounting, calculating unease. Daeho had never forgiven the board for choosing the founder's untested son over an older, hungrier cousin who had waited years for a throne that never came to him. He had smiled through every meeting, offered every counsel, played the loyal lieutenant so well that even Taejun's carefully suspicious mind had rarely bothered to run its usual tests on him, perhaps because, Family, however foolishly, had always been the one category Taejun still wanted, somewhere underneath the armor, to believe in without proof. Daeho had his own men follow Taejun quietly to the harbor light. Had photographs taken of the woman in the waitress uniform laughing at something the boss had said, and understood immediately what he was looking at. Not romance, not weakness in the sentimental sense his cousin would have dismissed, but leverage, the first and only leverage anyone had ever found against the man who tested everyone and trusted no one. Daeho began circling that leverage carefully, the way a man circles a fire he intends eventually to use for warmth or for burning, whichever proves more useful. He mentioned to the other captains, in tones of concerned loyalty, that the boss seemed distracted lately, that a man in Taejun's position could not afford a blind spot, that rivals across the river had noses for exactly this kind of weakness. He was not wrong, and that was what made him dangerous. Every word he said was calibrated to sound like protection while functioning as reconnaissance, mapping exactly how much the woman at the diner had come to matter, exactly how far Taejun might bend the rules of his own empire to keep her safe. When a rival syndicate from across the river, the Bake family, began making quiet overtures about territory near the docks, Daeho saw an opportunity too precise to waste, and he began, patiently, to build it. The attack came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of night that gave no warning of what it intended to become. Taejun was at the diner. Later than usual, the two of them sharing the last pot of coffee while Amara counted the register, when 3 cars pulled up outside with their headlights cutting hard through the rain-streaked windows. Taejun's instincts, owned over a lifetime of exactly this kind of moment, moved faster than his heart could keep up with. He was on his feet and between Amara and the door before the first man came through it, and when the second and third followed with weapons drawn, 4 of Taejun's own security detail, who had been quietly shadowing him for weeks at Sunwoo's insistence despite his objections, spilled in from the street behind the attackers and turned what should have been a massacre into a brief, ugly, contained skirmish. No one was killed. Amara was not touched. But in the chaos of the following minutes, as Taejun barked orders in a voice she had never once heard him use, as men who called him boss and sir moved to obey him instantly and without question, as the plain gray clothes and the careful anonymity fell away in the space of 90 seconds like a coat dropped in a fire, Amara stood frozen behind the counter and understood, in a single devastating instant, exactly who she had been feeding for weeks. She did not scream. She did not run. She stood very still. The way people stand when the floor beneath a familiar room has quietly become something else entirely. And when the last of the intruders had been dragged out and the street had gone silent again, she looked at Taejun the way she had never looked at him before, not with fear exactly, but with the particular, wounded clarity of someone realizing that every conversation they had trusted as true had been happening across a lie the other person had simply never bothered to correct. He tried to explain. He told her his real name for the first time, told her what he was, told her what he was, told her, with more honesty than he had offered anyone in a decade, that none of what had passed between them had been part of any plan, that he had never once tested her to use against her, that whatever this was had become the realest thing in his entire calculated life. Amara listened to all of it without moving, and when he finished, she asked him only one question, whether he had known, that first rainy night, exactly who she was and what she could be used for before he ever sat down in her section. He told her the truth, that he had come in to observe a shipment, not to meet her, that meeting her had not been the plan at all. It did not matter. The betrayal she felt was not about intention. It was about the months of silence that came after, the identity he had let her fall for without ever telling her the shape of the danger she had walked into. She told him, quietly, that she had spent her whole life learning what it cost to trust the wrong kindness, and that she needed him to leave, and that she did not know, right now, if she ever wanted to see him again. He left. It was, in a way, the hardest order he had ever obeyed, made harder by the fact that no one had given it to him except her, and he had never once in his adult life obeyed anyone simply because they asked. Sunwoo found him afterwards sitting alone in the back of his car outside the diner, not moving to drive away, staring at the flickering sign through rain that had started again as if the sky itself could not decide how to feel about the night's events. Sunwoo, who rarely offered his boss unsolicited comfort, said only that a woman who felt betrayed badly enough to send away the most powerful man in the city, rather than simply enduring his presence out of fear the way everyone else did, was exactly the kind of person worth the weight she was about to demand of him. Taejun did not answer, but he did, finally, tell the driver to go, and in the days that followed, he found himself doing something he had never done for anyone else under his protection, checking the security reports. On her safety not as a boss reviewing an asset, but as a man reading letters from someone he was not permitted to speak to, searching each line for some small reassurance that she was still, in whatever quiet and furious way, all right. The days that followed were the quietest and most dangerous of Taejun's life. He posted men to watch the diner in Amara's small apartment from a careful, respectful distance, not to control her but because he could not, in any conscience he still possessed, leave her exposed to the fallout of a war his world had dragged into her ordinary one. Daeho, watching all of this unfold, understood that the attack, though it had failed to look like anything but a rival's opportunism, had accomplished exactly what he needed. It had confirmed, beyond any doubt, precisely where his cousin's weakness lived, and precisely how far the great Winter King might crack if that weakness were properly applied. He did not wait long. 3 nights later, while Amara walked home from a shift with her guard momentarily distracted by a manufactured disturbance 2 streets away, engineered, expertly, by Daeho's own people, she was taken from the sidewalk outside her apartment building, bundled into an unmarked van, and gone before anyone could raise an alarm. The message that reached Taejun an hour later was not a ransom demand in any ordinary sense. Daeho did not want money. He wanted the empire, and he had calculated correctly that the only way to pry it loose from a man who had never once shown weakness was to threaten the one person that man had, against every rule he had built his life around, allowed himself to love without testing. The terms were simple and merciless. Taejun would step down publicly before the full council of captains and name Daeho his successor, or Amara would not come home. For the first time since the night his father died, Taejun did not calculate. He did not weigh leverage, did not consider optics, did not run a single one of the cold, careful tests that had governed every decision of his adult life. He gathered Sunwoo and the handful of men whose loyalty he had over the years actually earned rather than merely purchased, and he went to get her back with a fury that had nothing performative left in it at all. The warehouse where Daeho was holding her sat on the edge of the same docks where Taejun had first ducked into a diner out of the rain, a coincidence that felt, in the moment, less like chance and more like the city itself insisting he finish what he had started there. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Daeho, confident until the very end that blood loyalty would still mean something to men who had served the family for decades, discovered too late that his cousin's captains, the ones Sunwoo had quietly vetted and cultivated for exactly this kind of crisis, had never trusted him the way he assumed. And when the moment came to choose a side, they chose the man who had, whatever his flaws, never once asked them to betray anyone to prove themselves. Daeho was taken alive, disarmed, and left kneeling on the concrete floor of the warehouse he had thought would crown him. Taejun did not kill him. He looked at the cousin who had spent years smiling while planning exactly this, and felt, for the first time, no urge at all to answer betrayal with the same coin it had always been paid in before. He simply told his men to lock Daeho away for the council to judge, and he crossed the floor to where Amara sat bound to a chair, her eyes wide and furious and frightened all at once, and he knelt in front of her and untied her hands himself, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to test and nothing left to prove except that he had come. Sunwoo, standing beside him as the men secured the warehouse, remarked quietly that he had served 2 generations of Quan men and had never once seen either of them walk into a room that dangerous without first calculating the odds. Taejun said, without looking away from Amara, that he had stopped calculating the moment the message arrived, and that whatever it cost him, empire included, was a price he had already decided to pay before he ever reached the docks. It was, though he did not say it aloud, the first decision of his adult life made without a single test attached to it, no proof demanded, no leverage weighed, no ledger consulted. He had simply gone, because the alternative was unthinkable. And in that single unthinking act he had already become, without quite realizing it yet, the man Amara would eventually be willing to trust again. In the hours after, sitting together in the back of a car speeding away from the docks, Amara finally asked him the question that had been sitting behind her fear the entire time she was bound to that chair, whether any part of him, in that warehouse, had thought of the empire, of the cost, of what stepping down or losing everything might mean. He told her the truth, because it was the only currency he had left that felt worth anything. That he had not thought of the empire once, that somewhere in the last months at her diner counter he had quietly stopped being the kind of man who measured a person's worth against what they could cost him, and that the only ledger he had cared about that night was whether she came home breathing. It was not a grand speech. He did not perform contrition the way a powerful man performs an apology when he expects it to be accepted quickly and without cost. He simply said it plainly, the way she had once told him about her parents and her brother and her hungry years, and then he let the silence sit there, unfilled, because he had finally learned that kindness offered honestly does not come with a demand attached. The Council of Captains, gathered days later to judge Daeho, watched Taejun preside over the proceedings with a restraint none of them had ever seen from him before. No cruelty, no theater, only a plain accounting of what had been done and a sentence that stripped Daho of rank and standing without the bloodshed that tradition would once have demanded. Several of the older men muttered afterward that the boss had gone soft. That mercy shown once would be read as weakness and repaid with more of exactly what had just nearly cost him everything. Taejun heard the muttering and, for the first time in his life, found that he did not particularly care whether they approved. He had spent a decade governing through fear because he believed it was the only currency that held its value. And it had nearly cost him the one person who had ever shown him a currency that held its value better: patience, offered without interest, extended even to those who had not yet earned it. It took weeks before Amara led him back into the diner as more than a stranger paying his tab. She was not cruel about it, but she was careful. The way a person who has been burned learns to hold a flame at a respectful distance even after the fear has faded into something more manageable. He did not push. He came when she allowed it and stayed away when she did not, and slowly, deliberately, without a single test disguised as affection, he began doing the only thing that had ever actually worked with her from the very beginning. Simply being consistent, simply being honest, simply showing up without asking anything in return. He learned in those quiet weeks a kind of patience his entire empire had never once required of him. Sitting in the corner booth with nothing but a cup of coffee and no promise that she would sit down across from him, he discovered that waiting for something you cannot control, buy, or intimidate into existing was its own strange, humbling education. Some nights she spoke to him only long enough to take his order. Other nights she lingered a little longer, telling him some small thing about her brother's grades or a customer who had left an absurd note on a napkin, and he treasured those lingering minutes the way he had once treasured nothing at all, because he understood now that they were not owed to him and never had been. On the evening that mattered most, the diner was empty and the rain had cleared into a sky scrubbed clean and bright with stars over the harbor, and Taejun sat across from her in the corner booth where he had once tested her with an empty wallet and told her, without any of the armor he used to wear into every room he entered, that he was sorry. Not for who he was, but for every silence he had let her walk through unknowing, for every test he had run on her before he understood that some people simply do not need to be tested at all. Amara looked at him for a long moment, and then told him, gently and without cruelty, that kindness had never been something he needed to prove or earn from her in the first place, that the only thing that had ever been broken between them was his belief that it might be. He thanked her quietly, the words landing in a voice that had commanded rooms full of dangerous men, negotiated the surrender of rivals, and sentenced traitors to their fates, without ever once, in all those years, sounding this unguarded. She told him that if he wanted another chance, he would have to earn it, not in a single grand gesture, not with power or protection or anything an empire could purchase, but one ordinary day at a time, the same slow, unglamorous way she had once fed a stranger who had nothing to offer her back. She said it without bitterness, without using the words as a weapon to make him feel smaller than he already did, and that, too, was its own quiet lesson. That even now, even after everything, she was still choosing to extend him the same plain decency she extended everyone, simply calibrated, this time, with the caution that experience had rightly taught her to keep close at hand. For once in his life, the most feared man in the city did not argue, did not negotiate, did not try to shorten the distance between where he stood and what he wanted. He simply nodded and meant it and understood. Finally, sitting in the same booth where a waitress had once fed him without asking for anything, that the woman across from him had taught him the one lesson his entire cynical, guarded, blood-soaked life had never managed to teach him on its own. That real loyalty, the kind worth having, cannot be bought, cannot be tested, and cannot be forced. It can only be earned, quietly, patiently, one honest day after another, for as long as it takes.